may be seated. Good morning, church. It is such a delight to be with you this morning, and such a delight to get to preach on such a happy occasion as the baptism of our Lord. In our verse for today, our passage, we read about what the baptism of Jesus looked like. We hear the story of Jesus walking towards the Jordan River and encountering the Baptist John. Jesus asked to be baptized, and John, his cousin, is a little bit reluctant. He argues with Jesus, as Scott read. He says, "I'm not fit to baptize you. You should be baptizing me." But Jesus persists, and John relents. And then the Gospel of Matthew tells us that as Jesus is coming up back out of the river after being baptized, the heavens open. And down from heaven comes this miraculous dove, and it rests on Jesus, and a voice breaks out of the heavens and says, "This is my Son, the beloved. In him I am well pleased." It's the story of Jesus' baptism, the story that we're gathered to remember today on this particular Sunday. But we've been through a lot of this service together. We just reaffirmed our own baptismal vows, and so we have all figured out that we're not just here to remember Jesus' baptism. We're here to remember our own baptisms too. And if you're like me, you're listening to Scott read so well of this beautiful story from a long time ago, and you're thinking, what does this story with this fiery but reluctant prophet, this miraculous bird, this disembodied heavenly voice, this Son of God, what does it have to do with me and my baptism? And that's what I'm hoping to talk about and hoping to explore with you this morning. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, as we dive deep, deep into your word, let your Spirit descend upon us as it descended upon Jesus all those years ago. God, guide our hearts and our reflections, and may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. As many of you know, because it's a lot of what I talk about, when I'm not at school or here at the Dover Church, I'm off directing a summer camp, a Christian summer camp up in New Hampshire called Camp Wilmot. And this place is really dear to my heart, and it's also dear to the hearts of the Peterson family, which is pretty cool. And I was there a little while ago. I was talking to a camper, which is a lot of what one does at summer camp. This particular camper, he was a teenager, and it was his first summer away. It was his first week at summer camp. And we were only a couple days into the camp, but I asked him, how has it been so far? And much to my delight, he starts telling me about all his favorite things, about the food he loves, about the new friends he's making, and I'm starting to feel like I'm glowing, like this is just what I wanted to hear. But then he turns to me, and his face changes, and he looks a little bit concerned, and he says, "But Kayla, there's just one thing." And my heart stops, and I'm bracing myself. What's it going to be? Is he homesick? Is there some kind of bullying problem? Is he fed up with sharing a bathroom with 6 people he met 3 days ago? But no. He turns to me and he says, "Kayla, everybody here is so nice to me. They love me. But I just got here. I haven't done anything yet." And I honestly didn't know what to say. To be fair, I'm pretty sappy as a person, so a big part of me was trying not to tear up and make it awkward for him. But I didn't know the best way to respond to what he had told me. I gave him a hug. I think I said something like, that's how it's supposed to be. They love you just for being you. You don't have to do anything. But in that moment, I wish I had this story of Jesus' baptism in mind. I think it would have helped me know the right thing to say to that young man. Because the story of Jesus' baptism that we read today from the Gospel of Matthew, it's not a story about a new camper or a teenager in a new place, but it is a story of beginnings. This reading for today comes from just the 3rd chapter of Matthew's Gospel. It's actually the first moment that we get any mention of adult Jesus. In the previous chapters, we have baby Jesus. We have Jesus born in a manger, visited by magi, whisked away by his parents to Egypt. But Jesus as an adult is a new thing. And the baptism of Jesus is actually mentioned in a very similar way in all of the other 3 Gospels. In Luke and Mark and John, in those Gospels as well, the first mention we have of adult Jesus, the first thing that adult Jesus does is walk down to the water to be baptized. And I think that's important for us to remember, because as readers of the Bible so many years later, we kind of know how this story plays out. We've been to Easter and back so many times, and we've gotten to sit with these stories of all that Jesus does. We've gotten to reread and reread the accounts of Jesus healing and casting out demons, of his preaching and teaching, and meeting people on the margins with compassion. But at this moment in this unfolding story of Matthew, Jesus hasn't done any of that yet. And yet, as Jesus emerges from the water of his baptisms, on the very brink of his public ministry, at the very beginning of his ministry in the world, God greets him by calling him beloved. Jesus doesn't have a single miracle to his name yet, except for the miraculous circumstances around his birth. But if we're being honest, Mary did a lot of that work herself. He hasn't accomplished all those things yet that will make him worthy of praise. And yet God looks down from heaven, sends a dove to him, and says, "You are my beloved, I love you." And I think it's in this beginning, in this meeting of God and God reaching out from heaven to call him beloved, I think that's where we find our connection with what this story is saying about our baptisms. And I think that's also where our sticking point is. Because if we're being honest, what is really hardest to relate to? Is it the miraculous dove? Is it that God can act through nature, that the holy can be made manifest in the ordinary? Or is it that God reaches out before we've even had a chance to earn anything, before we've had a chance to do anything right or do anything wrong, and calls us beloved? If I'm being honest, it's not that a miraculous bird appeared or that a voice from heaven came down in a place far away in a time long ago. It's that I and all of us are beloved, are loved to the very marrow of our bones and the very tip of our toes. There's nothing we can do to earn it, and there's nothing we can do to change it. It's in this beginning, the beginning of Jesus and our beginnings in baptism, that we find the connection. And that connection continues as the story continues. In the verses and part of the story we didn't read for today, what happens immediately after Jesus' baptism is he's cast out into the wilderness. He's in the wilderness for 40 days, and in that time, or in the desert as we sometimes read about it, he faces trials and tests and temptations. He comes face to face with forces that try to convince him that the way he is not the way he ought to be, that he should start doing things differently, that he can't just be himself. He has to come face to face with those forces and battle them on his own, only with that spirit that descended on him and that knowledge that he is beloved. And I think we can relate to this too. I don't think a lot of us necessarily have devils telling us to jump off mountains so that our dad's angels can catch us. But you can't tell me that middle school and high school aren't their own kind of wildernesses, or the 40-plus hour work week, or trying to hold all of that and have some semblance of family time. Or maybe it's a relationship that used to feel close and good, but now is making you wonder what you're worth and wondering if you fit in. We all walk in our own personal wildernesses, and this story holds good news for us. And I think we can all relate to that. We can relate to what it feels like to feel alone, to second guess if we're good enough just as we are. I think of Sam, the camper I mentioned before. He comes from a loving family. He comes from a loving church. He's a great guy. He's successful in school and on the sports teams he's on. He has every reason to believe he's beloved, and yet it still doesn't compute. Because we face those wildernesses where voices inside of us and outside of us make us second guess. Because sometimes remembering our baptisms that for a lot of us happened when we were very, very small, it's not enough. And that's one reason why we gather together today, to reaffirm our baptism, to ritually immerse ourselves once again in those waters, to make it harder to forget, to teach ourselves kind of tricky songs so maybe they get stuck in our heads and we can fall back on that when it becomes difficult to remember. But sometimes that's not even enough. Sometimes we need a little bit of help from the outside. Maybe a voice from heaven, or a miraculous bird, or a coach, or a spouse, or a friend. Someone to remind us how beloved we are. And that, I think, is our calling today as Christians. We are called to live into that truth of our own belovedness and help our neighbors when living into that truth becomes difficult for them. We are called to remind each other that we belong just as we are. And I know I've only been here for a week, but I already kind of feel like I'm preaching to the choir on this one because of the incredible welcome that you all gave me last week when I had not had a chance yet to earn any of that welcome or that love. And I know you might be feeling differently because now you've heard me sing, so we can reevaluate. But when you welcomed me last week, I felt you truly living into what it means to be open and affirming. It means living into your own belovedness and letting that translate into the world and how you welcome strangers, how you raise your children, how you greet yourself in the mirror after a long day. And so I think when we consider beginning at belovedness, the connection between this miraculous, this storied baptism that took place at the Jordan River and our own more ordinary but still sacred baptisms that take place at this font, it becomes clear. It becomes simple. We are simply loved, simply and deeply loved, and as Max likes to say, there's nothing we can do about it. There's no question about who we are. That's been settled for us by God. The question is what we do about it. How do we carry or share that news of our belovedness, of the no prerequisites, the no requirements to love? How do we carry that in the way we live and the way we greet each other? How do we navigate all those voices we hear that tell us, if you're just a little bit more organized, or maybe a little bit more fit, a little bit more successful, or social, or patient, then you'd be worth it. Then you'd be good enough. Our calling as Christians is to join hands and help each other in the midst of all of that noise to attend to the voice of God, breaking open heaven to tell you that you are beloved. May it be so. Amen.
Lovely.